feel just kind of like completely at sea in this world that is like way too large for them to be able to really grasp. It feels perfectly suited for that character, those worlds. As soon as the reader looks at that map, they are immediately in those protagonists' shoes. Another map that beautifully sets up political conflict is the opening sequence of the Game of Thrones TV show. There are like carvings on this astrolabe that if you take the time to look at them, they show kind of the history of these warring families represented with these animal motifs. There are these complex clockworks that hint at the intricate machinations between all of these people that are all vying for the Iron Throne. And it just feels complex and intelligent and just beautifully put together. So for Sean McGuire's October Day map, which is also upstairs, I decided that the American state geographic boundaries should be treated like an afterthought. What was really important was the borders between these different fairy kingdoms and the little icons representing their ruling seats. I wanted someone to be able to look at the map for like a solid minute before they realized, like, oh, that's the Western United States. In a subtle way, like my viewpoint for that was that it reflects the fact that Toby, this main character, is kind of, over the series progresses, getting less and less human. She's like having to trade her humanity to save the people that she loves, and becoming sort of more and more immersed in this fairy world, which is like one of the main tensions of the series. And like, it's so subtle, I'm not sure if like I'm the only one who's picked up on this, but it fills me with joy, and I hope that on some subconscious level the readers are also picking up on this tension. Then once you know the point of view, once you know like what the actual geographic boundaries are, you want to look at making sure that the map feels like it kind of belongs in a world. You want to make it feel authentic and real. Map-making technology has changed so radically over the years that choosing a mapping style is going to immediately put your reader or your viewer into kind of a level of technology appropriate for that book. So whereas like a subway map or a random finale map of Middle Earth would be a really, really fun exercise, and I know that there are like some subway map style stuff up there, which I can't wait to look at in greater detail. Those are awesome, but they're not something that you would want at the beginning of the map, at the beginning of the book, because it doesn't set the stage for the reader. But if you open The Hobbit and you're looking at a reproduction of the same map that Bilbo and Thorin were looking at as they set upon their adventure, it's like holding an artifact of that world. It immediately puts you in those same shoes. Some of the earliest maps for fantasy novels traded on this a great deal. Like the maps for Gulliver's Travels and Treasure Island replicated like the same map-making styles that were kind of in vogue in that era. So people were used to looking at these kinds of maps, and suddenly here was a map of Lilliput, and it felt real to them because like that's what they were used to seeing. And so you felt like you could, like, if you did enough wandering around, you would eventually find yourself in Brobdingnag or the Admiral Benbow Inn. For Robinson Crusoe, which the author like didn't claim credit for on the frontispiece, like he claimed that it was written by the main character, leading a lot of people to believe that that Robinson Crusoe was a real person. In the third book, when they did a map of the island, it featured little illustrations of significant events in those stories, in the geographic places that were concerned. So it looks like a little 18th century infographic. It's great. So as we're, in order to place your maps in a specific time frame, we have to ask ourselves some questions. First, what medium are you trying to emulate with your artistic style? Do printing presses exist in your world? Like is this map going to be fit for mass reproduction? In the Cinder Spires universe, copper is everywhere. It's the only type of metal that doesn't instantly corrode upon contact with atmosphere, and so they use it for everything. And so I wanted to kind of honor copper in this black and white format by using a style similar to copperplate etching to create this map. And in the actual poster maps that I did, I used a copper foil, which is really pretty. If a map has to be handmade, how wealthy is its owner? A map belonging to a really rich person tends to be more a work of art, a work of prestige, whereas a map belonging to sort of a more like average worker is going to be like pure economy, pure functionality, have only the amount of detail that is necessary to do the job that they got the map for. For the Great Way series, it has a very strong Grecian influence, and so I spent countless hours on this map that looked like a gigantic mosaic tile inlay, like floor inlay, but unfortunately it didn't reproduce well in black and white when I tried, and so so that had to be scrapped, and I ended up doing a slightly more traditional one that took inspiration from some of the illustration style on Greek pottery. But oh my god, my heart breaks for that beautiful mosaic map. And feel free to mix media, by the way. The two maps for Mike Cole's Shadow Ops were ridiculously fun to do. Everyone in the series is like, the supernatural world is very new to these people, and so they're still kind of trying to figure out like how everything works and how to deal with the fact that some of these people suddenly have these supernatural powers. And so Mike, because he is a massive gaming nerd as well as being a very successful author, and one of the guys on CBS's Hunted, he decided that the people kind of best equipped to process this world are like the gaming nerds. So like because he has this military background and his books have a very strong military bent, I decided that I would have like a bunch of scraps of paper, like military maps where people are tracking the locations of this fugitive, and like layered on top of almost hand-drawn maps that were done by like whoever did the maps for their D&D group, essentially, and like made it look like a messy desk, and that in my mind spoke very eloquently to the idea of like this military with fantasy together. Then you want to ask yourself, what kind of navigational aids exist? Did explorers have to estimate the shapes of things, or do they have the mathematics and surveying equipment necessary to calculate like distances and angles accurately? Do they have airplanes? Do they have satellites? Like, what kind of view are they able to get of the land beneath them? Can people fly? If you look back at historical maps, you notice there's a certain like regular blobby sense to them, where like lines tend to be more or less straight, or like they fit into the kind of like the regular line, circle, equilateral triangle, right triangle that like you learn in first grade geometry class. There's the sort of like blobby repetition that characterizes those maps. So if you want to create a map that was sort of like pre-satellites, I keep on wanting to say speculation, surveying equipment, thank you, then sort of look towards that aesthetic. City planning, like how organized was the growth of the city. You can look at a map of Manhattan and immediately chart like how the city grew from the kind of the confusing mishmash of like farming streets and like cattle roads and stuff in lower Manhattan to just that impeccable grid that constitutes the rest of the island. I designed the Havel Morning and Havel Landing maps to kind of play with that idea, a study in contrasts. Morning is painstakingly regimented, like that's where all the wealthiest people live, and that's where the leader of this spire live, and so like they wouldn't have any trouble with untidiness, essentially, and so everything is like laid out immaculately, whereas Landing below them is like this very inventive, improvisational, sort of ramshackle type place, and so their maps look like a map of old London or like old Boston, like one of these old places that where people just kind of created roads where they needed roads. What kind of infrastructure exists? Is area land zoned for specific use? Is food grown nearby, or does it need to be imported? Do they have the infrastructure to support food being imported? Is the world technologically advanced for irrigation and plumbing? If not, you'd better hope that your city's water source can sustain the number of people that live there, Los Angeles. Geography, how does the shape of the underlying land impact your city's development? If you look at a map of Los Angeles that shows only the streets, you can easily see like where the hills and the mountains are because like grid. So I feel like I've talked about far too long, so I encourage you all to spend a lot of time looking at the maps upstairs. I hope that you'll really take the time to look deeply into these maps and try to imagine for yourself like where the artist was coming from, like the not artists like me, but like these fictional artists that a lot of our fantasy mappers kind of try to create in their minds that exist in this world. Like what kind of priorities, what values do they have? Why were they creating this map and for who? Look at all those visual cues, and maybe if you're so inclined, pick up one of the books whose map most intrigues you and venture further into the world than any map can take you. For Q&A. I don't know if I went like drastically over time, but so if anyone has any questions, I would love to answer them.
I'm very curious to hear whether you felt any need, urge, or whether it has actually happened of putting yourself into the map and subverting perhaps the story of the authors a little bit. Have you even imagined, fantasized about that, perhaps? The second little thing is, have you actually ever created a map from the alternative viewpoint of, in these, maybe not published with the books, but for yourself, perhaps?
So to answer the first question, I generally only create, with a few exceptions, I generally create, no exceptions, I create maps for people that I really respect, that I like their work. In some situations, I've had to do maps like before actually reading the book, but I always talk to the author and make sure that I'm expressing kind of what they want in a map. Maybe if I needed money to pay off gambling debts or something, and had to take commissions from people whose work I didn't particularly respect, a little bit of sort of subversion might trickle in, but I try to do my best to represent those worlds as fairly and responsibly as I can. And your second question, I have spaced.
Alternative.
Oh, yes. I have not. The only book series that I've done 2 maps for is that Harry Connolly book with the mosaic. Yes.
So you've done all this research that's going into making a map. You know, there's supposed to be this city down in the south, this geological feature up to the east. You have everything in your head that you're supposed to do, and then you have to put your pen to paper. Where do you start?
I generally start with just, I kind of like make a blob and then put like the cities kind of like where I kind of estimate they would be relative to each other, and send it to the author as like, are these proportions okay? Like, is this fine? Or like, yes, stop bothering me. Like, okay. A little more detail. Like, is this okay? Like, stop bothering me. Yes, that's fine. So like, oh, like move this over here, and like this should actually be wider. And so, so yeah, generally it's a reasonable amount of guess and check. Fortunately, with a lot of my maps, the author has been kind enough to like actually like do a little hand-drawn map for me, though it was different in Jim's situation because he had to wing a lot of things in the last 2 years. So I was like, I'm not exactly sure if these details are all exactly accurate, but I know the rough shape of things. Go.
So was there any pity for you in your works of art? You think it could be better, but for some reason you didn't?
I mean, I would just like to be, I think that all artists just kind of want to be better. like they all think that like, oh, my work isn't as good as such and such thing. I mean, I feel like I don't have as much of, like I don't have the rendering skills that the artist of the Leviathan series created. So like that type of caricature map wouldn't really be available to my repertoire. But like so far, I haven't ever been in a situation where there's like, oh, like I would want to be able to create this, but that's outside of my skill level. Like I always find something that works, I guess.
So ebooks are providing people with new options, new authors with new options. How about you? The idea of mixing together this e-format, is that going to change the way you create your maps?
I generally like have to design for like fairly like lowish size black and white, because like for paperback and everything has to be like very like clearly delineated, because sometimes the printing process used in the paperbacks isn't as high quality as you would want it to be, or that it is in hardback. And so on the instances that people, or that the publishers include maps in e-readers, which is most situations, but not all, it should be all, it's generally like it'll work on like those ancient Kindles that are black and white, or like any type of screen. It'd be cool if in the future they allowed like color Kindles and stuff, like to have like different versions, so like they could have a color format. Yeah, so yeah, that's something that is happening and has been happening, I think, if I'm answering your question correctly.
I was wondering how you approach creating maps for stuff like Kevin Hearn's The Yggdrasil, or if you were going to create a map for the Never Never and the Dresden Files, or if you were going to do, I'm going to butcher the name, like Tirn Og, like the realm of the Irish gods, that don't have borders and that change because of magic, and that like it's just all very hazy because it's mythology, and it doesn't actually, it's not like the Lord of the Rings gods who lived in an actual place. They live in like this sort of floaty spiritual realm. Like, how do you create a map for that?
Yeah, and like Sean and McGuire and I actually talked about like, oh, like could we ever do a map of the Shadow Roads? No, that it would change in 5 minutes. But the map of Yggdrasil was probably the hardest nut to crack, and I'm again pronouncing it the Hugo Weaving way. But Kevin had like very specific ideas of like how he wanted like how his Norse mythos worked. Like rather than being like 9 individual worlds, like they were like 3 planes of 3 different worlds, which like according to all of the extensive scholarship that he did of like ancient Norse mythology, he was like, that's how it is, and all the people saying I'm wrong are liars. So whereas like there were a lot of different depictions of these like sort of 9 individual worlds,